Thank you. As someone once branded as a terrorist by a state occupying my country in Ireland, my presence here today as a former prisoner who has served 13 and a half years in jail and who also topped a poll in the north of Ireland as Sinn Féin MEP in the last election, that shows you that the will of the people can prevail. So I thank you for the opportunity to be here. The formation of the United Nations International Court of Justice 70 years ago was an important development. The ideal of a more equal society with citizens having the opportunity to develop a just society based on the absolute protection of human rights was noble. The question is, how has that noble ideal fared in the face of state actions? At this summit discussion, my focus will be on international law and human rights in the context of state justice in the north of Ireland and in the occupied Palestinian territories, with the subtext of state and international communities' double standards. In 1983, Irish Nobel Peace Prize winner Dr. Sean McBride said, "When the position is analysed coldly and logically, Britain has played an indefensible role in Ireland, quite indefensible." Sean McBride was a former IRA Chief of Staff, a former Irish Foreign Affairs Minister, a former United Nations Assistant Secretary General, and a founder of Amnesty International. At that time in 1983, Britain's elite security units were engaging in the scandal of an official sanctioned shoot-to-kill policy against unarmed Irish Republicans in the north of Ireland. That policy evolved during the 1980s as Britain's military intelligence systematically directed and armed state paramilitaries in a campaign of terror and assassination against the entire Irish Republican community. But Britain's dirty war did not start then. A decade earlier, I witnessed in blood Britain stain an entire generation of my peers in Ireland, including my home city of Derry. I was just 9 years old when British troops murdered 14 peaceful, unarmed civil rights protesters on Bloody Sunday on January the 30th, 1972. I was nearly 50 before a British Prime Minister eventually accepted in 2010 that those state murders were unjustified and unjustifiable. The relatives of those murdered on Bloody Sunday are still pursuing an open and accountable police investigation of those responsible for their murders of their loved ones. There's an old saying that justice delayed is justice denied, and never was that more appropriate than for the British state violence in Ireland. Next Thursday, the 12th of February, is the 26th anniversary of Pat Finucane's murder. Pat Finucane was a father, a husband, a brother, and a criminal defence lawyer. He represented many of those subjected to British state prosecution. He fought injustices. He defended communities. He built up hope for communities battered by oppression and exhausted by conflict. He shone bright lights of human rights law onto the most horrendous of British state wrongs. And that's why he was targeted, specifically and deliberately, under Britain's shoot-to-kill policy. In February 1989, British paramilitary agents smashed their way into his unprotected home as he sat eating Sunday dinner with his family. A brilliant 39-year-old lawyer, threatened repeatedly, intimidated constantly, practicing courageously, shot 14 times by 2 gunmen and his wife Geraldine wounded. An attack by British paramilitary agents, armed, instructed, overseen and excused by the highest offices of the British state. Pat Finucane's murder has been the subject of a major international campaign. His murder stands as a monument to the immoral failings of those states which flout international law and which corrupt human rights in the service of unaccountable power. In 2001, as part of the Irish peace process, Tony Blair's British government gave an unequivocal commitment to establish a full public inquiry into Pat Finucane's murder, if that was recommended by an independent Canadian judge, Peter Corey. In April 2004, Judge Corey called for a public inquiry because British state collusion was evident in the case. Over 10 years later, Pat's family is still fighting for that full public inquiry. Instead, Britain has held desktop reviews, paper reviews, and reviews of reviews, and every British action and inaction has been designed with one single objective in mind: to bury the truth of state murder trail involving British intelligence, RUC Special Branch, the British Cabinet, and indeed a trail that leads all the way to Margaret Thatcher's door. In 2011, a senior British government officially told British Prime Minister David Cameron that Pat Finucane's murder was a dark moment in the country's history, he said, far worse than anything that was alleged in Iraq, Afghanistan. I cannot really think of any argument to defend not having a public inquiry, he said. Despite that, David Cameron has still refused to order a full public inquiry. At the time of the Irish peace process was being advanced with the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, a series of 6 test cases relating to the conflict in Ireland were concluding in the European Court of Human Rights. These cases, sometimes known as the McCurr group of cases, were Jordan, Kelly and others, McCurr, Shanahan, McShane and Finucane. All of these cases led to the findings that the British state had broken international law in the failing to comply with the procedural duty of investigation enshrined in Article 2, the right to life. The court found that in the cases involving the use of lethal force by agents of the state, an effective investigation in compliance with the requirement of Article 2 of the European Convention of Human Rights must be carried out. It set out minimum standards for such investigations. These entitled a prompt, independent, adequate and effective inquiry into which the next of kin have sufficient access to identify as far as possible both individuals and, importantly, systematic responsibility for such state killings. To remedy the violations found by the European Court, the British government put forward a package of measures. However, influential sectors of the British security apparatus have obstructed them, resulting in a further ruling a decade later deeming the package of measures an abject failure. The role of the European Union's institutions is critical in the journey of truth and justice and in building respect for international law and human rights. Of particular importance is European jurisprudence on the state's procedural obligation in relation to Article 2 of the European Convention of Human Rights. In November 2014, at my request, Human Rights Commissioner Niels Muizniek visited Belfast. Whilst there, he said, I quote, "Article 2, the right to life, is one of the core rights. It involves not only the state's responsibility to protect people from unlawful deaths, but also the responsibility to investigate effectively the circumstances of the death and punish those responsible. It is an absolute obligation. The UK government cannot wash its hands of the investigations, including funding of the investigations. These are the most serious human rights violations. Until now, there has been absolute virtual impunity for the state actors involved. The issue of impunity is a very, very serious one, and the UK government has a responsibility to uphold the rule of law." End of quote. The denial of truth and justice have been successfully highlighted and challenged through the dedicated vigilance and detailed commitment of relatives, lawyers, NGOs, truth campaigners, and my party, Sinn Féin. Thankfully, the Irish peace process has ensured that a representative and effective judiciary are now developing in the north of Ireland. And there is now a strong willingness by corners to challenge systematic obstruction. There is also a leadership in both the Police Ombudsman and Police Service, which Sinn Féin hopes will help address previous problems. We also hope that new measures to deal with the past and deliver truth recovery under the recent Stormont House Agreement will successfully comply with the requirements of international law and human rights. But as always, our continued democratic vigilance will be needed if further democratic values are to be irreversibly won. The need for democratic vigilance at European level was never greater than last summer, when the Israeli government once again engaged in mass slaughter in Gaza. The International Criminal Court's recent decision to consider the circumstances surrounding Israel's sustained attack on Gaza has the potential to offer hope for Democrats internationally and for the oppressed Palestinian people in particular. International law and human rights law must now become the beacon which leads the Middle East out of conflict and onto the path of a just peace, which, however imperfect, we in Ireland are now travelling. In 1983, Dr. Sean McBride chaired an international commission on the massacre of the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in Lebanon. That commission concluded that Israel, as the military occupying power, was directly responsible for the slaughter, torture, and summary execution of over 2,000 Palestinians. The Commission found that Israel had wantonly violated international law and indiscriminately targeted schools, hospitals, and other non-military targets. The United Nations General Assembly concluded, and this is what they said, the massacre was, I quote, an act of genocide. Over 30 years later, Palestinians are still awaiting that the Israeli military and political leadership to be held lawfully accountable for that genocide. And over 30 years later, Irish citizens are still fighting for the right for a coroner's inquest in relation to shoot-to-kill cases. These examples remind us of one certain indisputable fact, and that is that in every armed conflict, states tell lies. Lies of convenience, lies of contempt, lies of cover-up, state lies that kill the hope for truth, state lies that bury the truth of hope, and crucially, state lies that strangle the status and strength of international law and human rights. So in my role as chair of the European Parliament's Palestinian delegation, a new approach is key. We in Europe are a community of 500 million citizens. If the slaughter of conflict in occupied Ireland had happened on a European scale, over 1 million citizens would have been killed during 3 decades. If last summer's Israeli massacre in Gaza had happened across Europe, the deaths would have totaled over 600,000 citizens in just 3 months. Think about those facts. The governments of Britain and Israel both claim to uphold international law. Yet today, Britain continues to tell lies about its dirty war in Ireland to protect its generals, and Israel constantly carries out atrocities with impunity. We as Democrats have a duty to ensure the conflicts of our past must never be revisited. And we as citizens also have an obligation to build a future founded on a new platform of democratic values on human rights. The vision of an outstanding legal activist like Dr. Sean McBride is one which we each must value. His role in helping to build the European Convention of Human Rights is one that we each should emulate. Pat Finucane's dedication to justice is one which we each must uphold. His role in helping to build up belief in the power of accountability and in the rule of law is one that we must never forget. The international community's double standards when exercising or failing to exercise justice is being discussed widely by an international community. Can't you hear it? Many European countries have a history of colonisation and carrying out acts of state terrorism, yet here, at the home of the International Criminal Court, we do not see those states in the dock. States' ability to avoid persecution whilst at the same time wielding power to place others in the dock is creating societal awareness of double standards that is damaging the democratic values of international law and human rights. The international community, not least the European Union, has historically ignored the lies behind Britain's violent occupation of Ireland and avoided the truths buried by Israel's genocide in the Middle East. Thankfully, the complicit complacency is now changing. The truth is fighting back. And events like today are central in airing the voices of the oppressed. Individuals may be murdered by states, but idealism can never be stolen from society. As long as each of us champions the democratic values of international law and human rights for all, then our tomorrows will always be a new country. Let that be our role and responsibility in the time ahead. Go míle mé agah go léir. Thank you.